I guess that one of the things that part of his understanding of why it had to be disenchanted in order to make in order for the industrialization take place was a kind of functional sort of thing. You know, if you thought there were spirits in the river, then you couldn't treat it you couldn't investigate it as a scientist. That kind of idea. Now, if, as you're saying, that isn't the way that people in China and Japan look at rivers, they see rivers with spirits, and yet they can still treat them as objects of science as well. How do you explain that then? Because I suppose that would be Gellner's puzzle. Following on, if you're right, the question then becomes, what's happening to all the shamanism and stuff when they're doing the technology bit?
Well, that's a very, I mean, it's a question I often ask myself, and I haven't quite sorted it out. But my thinking, I mean, there is, when you probably, I hope your viewers and you know of the Needham question. The Needham question, Joseph Needham did a great study of science and civilization in China. And the Needham question was similar in that, why was it that science developed in the West and not in China? He was a biochemist, and they had all the technology up to about 1400, and yet it didn't develop into Western style experimental science. Why not? And he has a number of, he never solves the problem at all, but he has a number of theories. And one of them is the instability of the Chinese philosophical system, that if you have a world which is not separated off, everything is alive, and therefore you can't have experimental science, because life in Buddhist thought, for example, is filled with illusion, maya, illusion, and in Taoism and so on. And therefore, everything is shifting the whole time. Yin yang is a cosmology of constant shifts. Yin is changing into yang, yang into yin. It's a quantum world where everything is both and therefore, the basis of experiment is the repeatability. If you do an experiment in the West, then you have the same conditions, you should have the same outcome, and that proves that the experiment is true. But in China, you can't assume that, because things will have changed. And therefore, you can't have experimental science in China. You can have observational science, that things seem to be associated, and Chinese medicine and so on is based on observed patterns in the past. But you can't test the links, what YT causes or can cure lots of diseases. You can't actually test it, because you can't do experiments on the tea leaves and so on and so on. So part of Needham's solution to this is the West had, through its Greek science and its Christian principled attitude to nature, it believed in laws and repeatability and uniformity. And in China, in Eastern systems, you don't have that. And therefore, you could get around this problem by saying you couldn't have had a scientific revolution in China. But, and just as you couldn't have had an industrial revolution in China, because the Chinese had gone, their economy had gone down a track which my friend Hayami called it an industrious revolution. They had increased their production by working harder and having a bigger population. We had gone through, in England, an industrial revolution where you replace human labor by machinery of various kinds. Now, China's path would never lead to an industrial revolution. Our path could lead and did lead. So the first industrial revolution would never have happened in Japan or in China. But once it's happened, it's there on the shelf. Like you and I couldn't have invented a Windows operating system, but once it's there, you and I use Windows operating systems, and we don't have to know anything about computers to do it. And so the Chinese, once there is science, once there is Western technology, once there is an industrial civilization, you buy it off the peg, you get it off the peg. And it's better than that, because once you've got it off the peg, you then reverse engineer it, you understand how it works, and you have new inventions. And so the Chinese are quite, and the Japanese are quite capable of absorbing it, using it, developing it, but the original formulation of it would not and could not have happened there. So it was, we had to invent it. But once it had been invented, it was for mankind. I think that's probably the solution.